Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Arctic Summer College. My name is Max Grünig from the Ecologic Institute in Washington, D.C. As you can see, it's summer where I am, so it's always refreshing to talk about the Arctic in the middle of high summer in August. I'm very excited to have today actually two sessions, and Brendan O'Donnell will later moderate the second session with the participant presentations. I have the honor of moderating and introducing the first part of the program, the first hour, with Grant Sullivan. He's the Executive Director of the Gwich'in Council International, and he's a leader in clean energy for his community, and will actually present on getting renewable energy in his community, and overcoming obstacles, and also the multiple benefits of switching to a renewable energy future. I think that's extremely interesting, especially in the context of last week's discussion, where we focused a lot on gas and oil, and so fossil fuels, and high pollution fuels in the first part at least, and then talked a lot about the difficulty in the second hour last week, the difficulty of getting renewables and the challenges also with some of the renewables in our presentation by Jocelyn Jo Struck. And now I hope we can get more of a positive momentum here without taking too much of the time. Grant, I'm really glad you're joining us here today. Just for all the participants up front, so the webcam seems to not be working today, so you won't be able to see Grant, but you can definitely hear Grant and also see his slides. And he can also then answer questions later in the discussion. And so this is just a minor drawback, but I'm sure you can imagine him when you hear his voice and see the slides. So thank you, Grant. And you have the slides up. Everything is ready. I'll disappear and be back later for the discussion. Thank you.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. It's kind of nice that my webcam isn't working because I don't have to clean my messy office. I feel like I'm just speaking to my computer right now, but hopefully everyone can hear me all right. And I'm sure you'll let the moderator know if you need me to slow down a bit. So I'm Grant Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director of the Gwich'in Council International, which is a permanent participant at the Arctic Council Forum, Arctic Council table. The Arctic Council is a unique entity where permanent participants, or the indigenous groups of the Arctic, actually have a seat at the main table. So we're in a very fortunate position, and we've been able to leverage that position to have a really good look at renewable energy in our Arctic communities. So the Gwich'in Council International represents about 9,000 Gwich'in in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon and Alaska. Like I said before, it's one of the few organizations where Indigenous actually have a seat at the decision-making table. It really does give us an opportunity to advocate our voice at an international level to look at sustainable development, the environment, to kind of build our communities. The Gwich'in Council International is made up, it's an umbrella organization, and it actually has two land claim agreements in Canada, and that is the Vuntut Gwich'in, which are a self-governing nation, and also the Gwich'in Tribal Council, which is also near self-government, and also the Alaskan Gwich'in as well. That's linked to a very different a network of Gwich'in organizations, including co-management of wildlife, land, water, as well as development corporations. in our region. Primarily at the Arctic Council, we're involved in the SDWG, which is the Sustainable Development Working Group, which really shows why we're so into the renewable energy, getting them into our communities. I'm going to talk a little bit about our Gwich'in communities, just to give some context of what our realities actually look like and what they are and where we're from. So this is a map. You can see this is an Indigenous language map that we use just to kind of demonstrate where we are in the overall picture. So if you look at the top right corner of the map, that's the Gwich'in traditional territory of where we are. As you can see, we're one of the most northernly First Nations in North America, and only the Inuit live further north than us. So we are truly an Arctic First Nation. And you'll also notice as well that the Gwich'in, the traditional Gwich'in Sullivan area actually crosses the U.S.-Canada border as well. This is just a specific map of the Gwich'in settlement area. This is under the Gwich'in Tribal Council. And a lot of the communities I'll be talking about in my presentation are these communities. So in the top right-hand corner, you'll see Inuvik. So Inuvik is my hometown. That's where I'm actually from. I am a Gwich'in beneficiary or participant in the Gwich'in Tribal Council Land Claim Agreement. I spent the majority of my life living in Inuvik, and it's the regional hub basically for the Beaufort Delta area of the Northwest Territories. In the Gwich'in settlement area, we do have surface and subsurface rights throughout, and you can see with the scale there where we have these surface and subsurface rights. The communities themselves, Inuvik is the biggest community at about 3,500. Sigachik is about 150 people, and Fort McPherson is about anywhere from 900 to 1,000, and Aklavik is about 600. These are small communities. They're small, isolated, diesel, remote communities. All communities there for their power generation they're on diesel power as their primary source for electrical generation, and in most cases, heating fuel as well. It's funny, in your introduction there, you said last week they talked about oil and gas. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit of oil and gas today as well. Since the 70s, there's been proposals to build a pipeline through the McKenzie Valley to bring resources from the Delta to southern markets. The desire to build a pipeline credited with giving the impetus of modern land claims that we are so grateful to have now. The government of Canada really needed to clarify land ownership so the pipeline could be built. So basically, we had a big push to actually complete our land claims in a timely fashion, which is a real benefit to the Gwich'in. The Gwich'in were actually stakeholders in the Aboriginal Pipeline Group, which was an entity that was going to help build the McKenzie Valley Pipeline. It was recently announced, though, that the project is on hold indefinitely, which has had a major impact on our local economy as well. Historically, Inuvik has been a oil and gas town. Everything has been driven by oil and gas money, other than government money. So we are right now currently in the Inuvik area, or the Beaufort Delta area. We are experiencing a pretty significant downturn in the economy. With the pipeline no longer happening, it is pretty dismal there. There's about 54 houses that have been taken back by the bank, and a town of 3,500 people. That is quite significant. So we are feeling the effects of the lack of development in the communities. That being said, I'm sure most of you have heard that the Trump administration plans to open up the Alaskan Wildlife Refuge reserve to oil and gas development. This has been denounced by the Gwich'in as a proposed area for the area, because the grounds that he's proposing are the traditional calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd, and the Gwich'in culture is built around that herd. This is a picture of a Gwich'in Council International board member, Sam Alexander, appearing in front of the Congressional Energy Committee to bring forward the Gwich'in perspective. As you can see, the Gwich'in are not against development. We are stakeholders in the pipeline, but we do not wish to see oil and gas projects proceed at any cost, and therefore stand opposed to oil and gas drilling in ANWR. Potential projects in the Yukon have also met with some resistance as well. When I initially started looking at renewable energy as a possibility for our communities, getting the information was the critical part. And I found that was the first step to figure out if and how renewables can work in our communities. And my background is I'm a finance accountant guy, and I wanted to know the facts about what does it actually cost to generate power in our communities. And I don't know how many of the attendees or my fellow panelists have gone through a utility application to try to pull out the cost, but it is quite difficult to do. But I saw that as the starting point from where to begin. If we could get an understanding of where the utility is coming from and how their cost structure works, then we'd have the opportunity to kind of look at the renewable energy objectively and match them against traditional sources and see where they land and what costs they can do. So the Gwich'in Council International came up with this report after a very thorough review of the PUB applications, the Public Utility Board applications, the general rate applications to pull this information out. And just so everyone's aware, our website contains all these documents and everything I'm presenting on here. So if you are interested to have a more in-depth look, we do have the technical report there and an executive summary of all these documents I'm putting out there, and feel free to reach out to me to discuss more. So to get the facts, basically, a lot of the fuel that we use is shipped up by ice road, in some cases by airplane to a community, and then in the coastal communities by boat and barge. So all these different transportation options have different risks associated with them. We are in the high Arctic. For example, it's a 1,600 kilometer drive from a major center to Inuvik. So and basically about 900 of those kilometers there's one gas station in between, and that's it. So obviously, like, just the remoteness of the community, like of the Arctic itself, presents a large risk. If there was a spill, the response time would be really, really slow. In case of the airplane, the community of Oak Crow is a fly-in community, and they do annual flights into the community hauling diesel fuel. And, that is just the most expensive way to get fuel to a community is you fly it in. And of course, on the coastal communities, they use barges and everything else. But barges, again, are so tight on the time schedule of, can they actually get to the community at the time they need to get the community there? And it's a one-shot deal. If they don't make it, they don't make it. So all the traditional kind of ways to deliver fuel, they have inherent risk in them. And how it's done currently, so The fuel is stored in large community tanks throughout the Arctic, and they are aging out. So spills are a reality. Like that is something that is happening, and the community is dealing with that. So that's the current situation of how things operate now. But once again, that's just to get the understanding of how the current system works, and that's been our approach. We want to get to the point where we can have a good understanding of how the utility works and how we can help them change over into renewable energies to help address some of their concerns too. All these concerns are shared not only by these are joint problems that the community and the utility and the government need to address and work together in collaboration. So how we broke out the actual costs. We wanted to see where the savings would be and what the additional costs would be using renewable energies. So you look at the left-hand corner. So we picked communities across Canada's north to kind of get a general picture of how things work and what the costs were across our circumpolar north in Canada. So you see, we picked Destruction Bay in the Yukon, Old Crow in the Yukon, because Old Crow is very unique because it's one of the communities you have to fly in fuel. Fort McPherson, which is just south of Inuvik. It is tied to the road system. And then Inuvik, of course, because Inuvik is the biggest thermal zone in the Northwest Territories. And also it has a bit of a uniqueness to it that it has diesel and natural gas. So Inuvik is sitting on vast amounts of natural gas reserves, but there's just no market for it because of the McKenzie Valley pipeline that has fallen through. That was the long-term solution, but currently Inuvik is in a serious energy need. Like what they're doing now is they're actually shipping up liquefied natural gas from Delta, BC, all the way to Inuvik for power generation. So Inuvik was considered the community of Tuktoyaktuk. That was also chosen as well too because they just completed the road to Tuk from Inuvik. So that is the most northerly point you can get to by road in Canada now. And then moving across Rankin Inlet, Baker Lake, Cambridge Bay, and Iqaluit. These were based primarily on the size of their load, of how much energy they use, and trying to give them the information. While this information is great, and I've had many requests to, do all the communities, the intention was behind this study was to set up a system of how communities can then pull this information out for themselves. It was more of a processing. Yes, this is the process of how we did it, and how the other communities can then get this information as well. So working down the list here on the bar graph, what the costs are made up of. The carbon tax is coming, and we accounted for that. We don't have that system in place yet. That's happening this September, but it's going to be a range from $10 to $50 per ton. So that's the light yellow cost there. The capital cost components, the cost of the building facilities, payback over the life of the equipment. That's pretty standard stuff, but we broke it out into an amount. Operation and maintenance. This one was kind of interesting because figuring out if renewables were installed into the system, what effect would that have on the operation and the maintenance? Would that extend the life of the asset? And what that does to their amortization schedule and their overall cost as well. Well, that's the next step of this study. Right now, we just wanted to identify what that cost actually is and getting it there. And then followed by the overhaul cost as well. What those, on X amount of hours, there's a major overhaul required. If we reduce the the operational hours, one would assume that we would extend we potentially push out the dates or the timing for the overhaul costs. And of course, the most obvious one is the fuel costs. And the fuel costs includes acquiring, shipping, and storing the fuel in the community. And this is what is usually used for when people evaluate renewable energies. It's just considered the fuel cost. And what we want to really highlight too is there's more to this picture than just the fuel cost of renewable energy and how that looks. And it's not, renewable energy really doesn't have a shot in the Arctic unless we consider some of these other costs to come to be included in the overall price of things. So the hope of this report is to start the discussion of establishing a real fair price for renewable projects in the Arctic to make them work. Of these communities that I've mentioned, per capita, they're right up there in overall greenhouse gases. The majority of the time, like, we do have long winters, and they're diesel remote communities. So there isn't much of a backup system built. So a lot of the gensets are overbuilt to ensure that security. Like, I'll give you a real life example. We had a power outage in Inuvik, and it lasted 6 hours, and it was December. It was minus 36. Houses were freezing up in 6 hours. So when your house freezes up, all your pipes are frozen and they burst. And so, like, reliable power is so important to the people of the Arctic. We need to make sure that we have a well-diversified power grid system that can support communities to kind of prevent horrible things like that happening. So we need to start incorporating different types of energy systems to ensure that those things like that just don't happen. We also put in there the health and environmental impacts. While information on this is not readily available, the information we did find was roughly between 3 and 19 cents per kilowatt hour. That's something that the utility does not consider in providing their cost, but we do feel like that is something that we should be looking at as well. And just so everybody's aware, all the information that was gathered on these communities was from the general rate applications. So these are the numbers that the utility is putting forward to the public utility boards. So they're their own information. None of this information is gathered from any other sites other than the health and environmental impacts. Like, everything else that's their cost. This is a little more in-depth kind of a summary of the fossil fuel generation costs in the communities. So on the top, you can see it's broken by the current utility costs and potential greenhouse gas carbon cost. So just to kind of give you an idea of where each community in Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Yukon, and their fossil fuel generation load megawatt hours. As you can see, Inuvik is by far the biggest of the communities for the Northwest Territories. And Iqaluit is the biggest diesel, which is in Nunavut, is also a really big consumer of diesel. So you can kind of, from this chart, I look at this and say, okay, well, there's obviously some really hot spots that need to be addressed quickly to actually have a significant reduction in greenhouse gases. That being Inuvik and Iqaluit and Cambridge and Rankin. Like there are some big communities there that we can do things with. So based on that, if we look at Inuvik diesel for the variable fuel cost, we're looking at about 33 cents per kilowatt hour. The other costs, which include that's all the fixed component, the operations and everything else. You'll see that those numbers are all the same. And that's because the way the general rate applications work in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut and the Yukon, is they have zones. And the zones where they zone communities together. So to actually pull out the very specific operational costs per community is not really possible. So that's why the numbers are all exactly the same. But the fuel costs, while relatively similar, there is some differences there. And that comes to our total cost of electrical generation in the communities. And then adding on the additional cost of the potential greenhouse gas tax cost as well. That being said, so these are the costs in the utilities costs. The government of the Northwest Territories, Nunavut and Yukon, well, not the Yukon, sorry, Yukon in some cases, they heavily subsidize the electrical cost in Inuvik. So while it might cost the utility in Inuvik for electrical generation using diesel, it costs them 64 cents. The consumer only pays about 32 cents a kilowatt. This has gone up since the last time of this has happened, but it's approximately half the price until they meet a load. But that's still, that cost is being transferred off to the government as well. So that was part of the exercise as well, is to kind of get to the actual cost, because what we're seeing on our bill is 32 cents, but at 32 cents, renewable projects don't work in the north. But at 64 cents a kilowatt, all of a sudden they're starting to make more sense. So through this process, we've been able to kind of move away a lot of the confusion and actually get to the cost. So we can actually have really meaningful conversations with the utility themselves to actually have it where we can come from the position of we understand what their costs really are. And all these reports have been shared with the utilities and presented to them many times. So they agree with what we're presenting, because we took the approach where using their public utility, their general rate applications to the PUB. So it's their information. We're just making it accessible. So we have a better understanding of where they are. As I mentioned previous in the slide, the additional costs of diesel fuel power generation do have other social impacts on them. Most notably, the health and environmental risk associated with diesel fuel transportation. Like I said before, it's a long road and there's a lot of space in between. So if accidents do happen, it is tough to kind of get back to them. And truthfully, the spill response time is not great. There's been accidents where there's been blizzards. I mean, accidents usually happen when there's blizzards and the road is near closing. So if the road is closed and it's not optimal sites, like there could be days of fuel being leaked in the Delta or in the Arctic. And the Arctic, as everybody knows, is a very, very fragile ecosystem that takes a long time to recover from these types of things. The storage on its own, whilst the storage facilities are getting a lot better in the Arctic, with climate change, like especially on a lot of the coastal communities, like the community of Tuktoyaktuk is currently losing shoreline every year at a really rapid rate because of the shorelines disappearing with the ocean, and that's a real risk to a lot of the infrastructure that's in place for storage. Like that's something that we need to consider and need to be on top of right now. And how do we mitigate the storage potential? How do we make it smaller through the use of renewable energies to have smaller, more efficient tanks rather than the big tanks that have been there since the 70s. And most of the communities in the north, other than Inuvik, they still use the diesel fuel tanks beside the house. Now, I'm sure everybody who has insurance, their insurance provider warns them of the liability with this. But once again, if we look back at the map of the Arctic communities, they are very remote. And getting access to capable installers of tanks and heating systems, it is a challenge, and it's a reality across the north, getting access to technical trades that can install these things. So there could be, I don't even want to think about how many fuel tanks are currently leaking in the north for home energy heat, whereas if renewables were in place, there would be a lot less risk associated with that. This is just a summary page of the utility fossil fuel generation costs for all the communities that we looked at. Some of the more detailed information, such as the plant efficiency for each plant in each of the communities, the price per fuel for each of the communities, and the cost per generation per kilowatt hour. All very important things to have a good understanding, like what the communities have used this information for. That GCI has done is they've taken this report and had the discussion with their respective utility, and this is how they start their power purchase agreement or IPP. So they have the facts in front of them, and they know what they're kind of working towards and what they need to kind of match up with. And from that too, we also added the non-fuel operating costs as well too. Once again, you can see that these are just basically divided through a cost, because the way the utility has done their applications, it's by zone, so it's pretty hard to break out. The one surprising thing that kind of popped out to me on this after doing this study was the average cost of the overall cost in Nunavut. I was surprised it wasn't higher, because Nunavut, all these communities are fly-in, fly-out communities. I would have thought that the overall cost would have been higher. That being said, too, the infrastructure in Nunavut is quite a bit older. The majority of their infrastructure for electrical generation is near end of life. So I'm not sure how that has come into play there, but that is something worth further examination. And not surprisingly, the Yukon end was relatively low, including the Old Crow site. Old Crow, a year prior to this study being done, they had just received a brand new electrical generation set, which was very efficient, and it didn't cost as much to operate. So that's where that number came from, why it was so low. I mean, if we did account for the capital cost of adding that new system, that would have changed the numbers significantly. But we didn't do that. So, I mean, and if you look at the capital component column, you only see 10 cents per kilowatt. But if we broke it out specifically just for the Old Crow and their new gen set, it would have put it more around 18 cents a kilowatt. And then the final column is the total utility cost per kilowatt hour by community, each one. And like I said before, these numbers have gone up, at least in the Inuvik, as far as I'm aware. It's been up. They recently just bumped it up 13%. So all these numbers have been updated. Oh, haven't been updated, sorry. The estimated greenhouse emissions costs of the fuel generation using the fossil fuel generation, just to be clear that this is just for the electrical generation. This does not include the heat side of things. And this was to kind of basically get a rough estimate of the potential impacts of the greenhouse gas here in Canada at the $10 per ton and the $50 per ton. So you can see there the overall impact at the highest being in the Yukon and Destruction Bay at 2.4%, and all the way up to 12% at $50. So a pretty clear incentive to start reducing the overall greenhouse gas emissions in the communities, because like I said before, the economy in the north right now, people are struggling to maintain their homes in the north and maintain ownership. And that's pretty difficult with these additional costs coming in and of the greenhouse gases and the power generation itself too. So we do need to address this to maintain and keep our communities alive in the north. Like I previously mentioned on the earlier slide, this was the outside information we were trying to capture regarding the social costs from fossil fuel and air emissions. Wasn't a lot on the specific north information for a lot of this stuff. A lot of this information was done in the south, and these studies were done on the south. So it was a bit of extrapolation to see which worked. Yeah, it was just to get a bit of an eye opener of what this could look like out there. And so we came to the DT Schindel study of 2015, the Muller climate and health impacts from specific air pollutants, NRC 2007, health and non-climate impacts of specific air emission pollutants, and the Mackall and Ritz health impacts of specific air emissions. So from this, you can see the CO2, the total social cost, cents per kilowatt, and all these are in cents per kilowatt. The diesel transportation in the DT study put them at about 55 cents per kilowatt, which is quite high. But this just gave us a range of what the social impacts are kind of coming in at, and that's why we listed it at 3 cents per kilowatt to the upside of 19 cents a kilowatt. And some of these dollars were included the U.S. to Canadian dollars, so we kind of took the best range that we could find at the current time. But once again, though, none of these costs are considered when looking at renewable energy projects currently in the north. Just wanted to run through a few of the projects that the north is in our communities that we're trying to push through that are currently actually even happening. Lots of early acceptors on renewable projects in the north. The Gwich'in people have a long-standing kind of approach to life where when you harvest a caribou, you use everything and you only take what you need. The same approach applies to the energy production. You take what you need and you only harvest what you need. So it is a great way to kind of look at renewable energies of taking what you need and only harvesting what you need to survive. And also, I want to really stress that these projects in the community were done in partnership and collaboration with the utilities, with outside partners and the community. To make projects work in the north, you need to have a community initiative. It needs to be a community accepted project. To get a project to take hold, you need to involve the community and all the stakeholders. That's just how the north works in my part of the world. The first project I want to talk about is the solar project in Alaska, in Fort Yukon, Alaska. While these projects are relatively small, but the impact in the communities that they're having, it really is a beacon that the community is ready for change and they want to be looking at these things. So solar panels were installed in the tribal government office. And those of you who travel in the north, there's always a tribal government office in every single community. So the estimated kilowatt hours is about 1,800 kilowatts of electrical production per year. This was a high install cost of $3.50 to $4 per watt installed. It was an expensive undertaking, but that's because, you know, it was the first project installed in Fort Yukon, and you know, it takes time to establish this, but hopefully, you know, the early acceptors will help pave the way for other communities. Looking at about $11,000 US dollar offset for the electrical things, and there is a link there as well at the bottom of the page for you guys to kind of follow up on. And I'm assuming that my PowerPoint here will be made available. Like I mentioned, the Old Crow Solar Project. Old Crow is such a unique little community because it is this fly-in, and the community is so ready for renewable energy in their communities. So Old Crow is the most northerly community in the Yukon. It's powered by 3 diesel gensets, consuming approximately 500,000 liters a year. And just to remind people, that 500,000 liters is flown in. So this, and it's flown in multiple trips in a small remote community with a gravel runway. So like, it is logistically a really difficult way to get fuel to the community. The Gwich'in government is partnership with ATCO, the Yukon College, and the government of Yukon Energy Branch. And once again, like, I really like this to show this slide because it is all about collaboration with the community. And that's how this project is getting built. While the Gwich'in government, they are definitely the push behind this, but it's in partnership with ATCO. It's in partnership with the Yukon Energy Research Center and the Yukon government. This project is happening. The facts about it is about 330 kilowatt solar photovoltaic array, which is a huge system for such a small community. Displace 90,000 liters of diesel fuel and 267 tons of CO2 per year. And just if you guys do want more information about this, Old Crow has done a great video. It's on YouTube. If you type in Gwich'in government solar, it's a great video of what this project means to the community. And it is a really source of pride for the community that they're doing this. And I can't stress that enough. I think it's so important that these renewable projects, they're not just about energy consumption. A lot of them are about energy, they're about community pride. And that the communities are looking to be self-sufficient, and they want to make their own communities, and they want to make these decisions for their communities. And energy is an essential service, and they want to have a say in the essential services that are in their community. I'll talk a little bit about biomass in Inuvik, Fort McPherson, and at Klavik. Well, when everyone thinks about biomass in the north, like Inuvik is right on the tree line, but just south of Inuvik, we do have quite a decent wood supply, like access to potential pellet supply for the Boulevard Delta region. the GNWT is looking to has set in their energy strategy. They would like, the government of Northwest Territories has set an energy strategy at 40%. All their buildings be heated by biomass in, I think it's 5 years. And that is a huge commitment by the government of Northwest Territories, because obviously they have the majority of the large buildings in the north, and are the primary users and producers of greenhouse gases in the north. So they are looking at aggressively pushing biomass in the north, with the kind of understanding that they will create the market, install the biomass boilers, get the market there, and then start to develop the local supply of how we feed these biomass boilers as well. Just as an example, in Inuvik, 6 buildings using oil and heating, approximately 31,000 kilojoules per year. And then the hospital alone, Inuvik is a regional hub for all medical services throughout the Port Delta. It accounted for 69% of the heating load, just one building. So what I'm trying to say here is in order to make a large impact, if we have a good understanding of where the heating loads are and how we can really impact and affect those heating loads, we can make a relatively large impact overall on the heating loads of the north, targeting these specific places to make it work. Which brings me to our community energy plans. This was a map provided by just demonstrating how many community energy plans there are in the circumpolar and in the rest of Canada as well. While the Northwest Territories at 100%, it does say, yes, we have a community energy plans that are there. Now, the issue with the community energy plans, though, are most of the time the community energy plans just don't have the financial capacity to move projects forward. And I think that's been an ongoing issue. And hopefully our Diverging from Diesel report will help assist communities to kind of understand the financial realities that are in place to actually move forward their community energy plans. The other things, a lot of those community energy plans, for the renewable energy costing has come down so much that at the initial time of writing the plans, a few technologies might have been ruled out just because of the high cost of them. And so we need to kind of make sure that we realign the goals and objectives of the communities with the technology and with the plans out there. The other issue we're facing is the local governments have limited authority to move plans into action. We need partnerships, collaboration between all the stakeholders to really get these plans moving into place. Like, there's no use a community making an energy plan that the utility is not on board with, because if the utility is not on board with it, it's going to be an uphill battle. We need to have comprehensive, inclusive plans in partnership with all the stakeholders to move the project where we want it to go. And this is the other side of the coin as well. Some of the times the communities don't have much input into the overall plan itself. If you go to one community in the north, you've been to one community in the north. And what I mean by that, every community is different. They're going to want their energy needs or their energy vision will be different for each community. Some communities will want to, like Inuvik, for example, there's potential for wind project there, for a large scale wind project, and the communities behind it. And some communities, they might not want a wind project, like say in Sachs Harbor, where they're concerned about their bird population and what a wind turbine will have effect on them. They might want to look more at energy efficiency, but that's up to the community to make that decision in partnership with the other stakeholders to have that open and full discussion on the topic. And finally, the lack of political and stakeholder and staff support. The communities are pretty stretched. There's usually an SAO position that is in charge of everything. It's in charge of housing, in charge of medical transportation. There's in charge of if there's a fire in the community, they're dealing with it. The communities are tight knit, and the capacity is stretched. And renewable energy, while a long-term goal, sometimes gets pushed back with the immediate what's on my desk right now, on my what's on fire, and how do I put it out. So we do need that support of getting the administration up and running to really focus on this as a long-term objective. In my work at the Arctic Council, this map came about, and the red dots show remote diesel communities, off-grid settlements throughout the circumpolar. And a lot of the time, in Canada anyway, we look north-south for our solutions. And clearly by this map, we have a lot in common with our neighbors to the east and to the west of how we can manage these remote off-grid diesel sites. And that's one of the really fortunate parts that I've been lucky to work with in the Arctic Council, because we do get access to and exposure to different solutions that work in so many different other northern sites, not a southern site, but a northern site. So we can actually have some sort of confidence that, yes, this will work at minus 35. And from this discussion we've had, like once I saw this map, it was pretty clear that we do need to draw more on these folks and learn from their mistakes and successes. And from that, we came up with our solution, which is the Arctic Sustainable Energy Future Toolkit. Now, this is the first project that the Gwich'in Council has actually ever presented at the Arctic Council level, and it's our first project that's actually been accepted by the Arctic Council. And I'm not sure how familiar with the audience is with getting a project endorsed by the Arctic Council, but it was quite the achievement for our small organization of two to pull off. So we are quite pleased with that.
Grant, just very, very quickly, didn't want to interrupt or pressure at all, because this is so exciting. I just wanted to highlight that time is ticking, nevertheless, and we're at 53 minutes into the session. Just saying, we can of course go 1 or 2 minutes over, but we also have the two other speakers later on. Just wanted to let you know, but sure. I'll be quiet now.
Okay, I'll wrap up quickly here then. The toolkit, as expected, it's just a step-by-step toolkit for the community to kind of go over everything I've just talked about, and how to develop their own community energy plans with the right people in the room. But it's looking from the east to west on how we do this, how we increase energy literacy, understanding the impacts of diesel, looking at the lessons learned from other communities across the Arctic, which I can't stress enough is such an important tool that we can use, examining the medium and short-term energy demands. And then this is the final step is, one of the final steps is identifying the options for energy demand reduction, which is the low-hanging fruit. And then finally, implementing the community energy plans. Just to kind of give you a few other of the projects that GCI is really involved with within the renewable energy kind of envelope. We really do think that the Arctic Council needs to be involved in renewable energy. There's a clear community interest and desire to work on these issues. And the circumpolar neighbors are just such a great resource for us to share their expertise, their resources, and facilitate information getting back to the communities. It can really help leadership at the local ground level to make these long-term decisions. A few of the other projects we've been involved with, so GCI co-led the ARENA project, which is basically a capacity building session for local communities to kind of get a general understanding of what else is out there. We sent one of our local leadership on this project, and just to quote him, he was in Kotzebue, Alaska, where they have established wind turbines, and he looked around and he said, "This just looks like Tuck," which is a neighboring community to his hometown. But they had a wind turbine. They had multiple wind turbines there in operation. To me, that was such a huge value to normalize renewable energy in the Arctic. And of course, the Arctic Energy Summit that was held in Finland 2017, we also co-led that project. And with that, I will close up my presentation. Hopefully I met the 3-minute mark and didn't put everybody to sleep.
Oh, not at all, not at all. Thank you, Grant. It was really fascinating because of how much you could cover, how much detailed knowledge you also have. That's really amazing, and I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions even now. So I didn't say it in the beginning, and I hope people still remember how the questioning works. You can raise your hand, you can type in a question, or type a question even into the chat box. These are all possibilities. And if you don't have a question ready right now, you can, of course, contact Grant. You see the contact information here, and reach out to him. And you mentioned earlier that you will post, that you make the slides available, and we will, of course, also post a webinar so people can basically get back to what they've seen and maybe look at particular aspects. I have to say, this is really exciting. I hope that you will get a lot more, I would say, projects, but also going beyond projects, maybe programs for renewables in Arctic communities, in isolated communities. I wanted to ask you a question because I think maybe it was last year, but maybe before, we have a former colleague from Ecologic Institute, actually, who then moved back to first to Denver and now to Alaska. Piper Foster, she works now at a company, or she founded a company. It's called 50 Hertz, I believe. Is it 50 Hertz or 60 Hertz? One or the other. Both make sense depending on which electricity grid you're on. But anyway, that's about microgrids for off-grid communities, and also about integrating renewables in these microgrids. And she's in Alaska. I don't know if you've been in touch, but I think she might be an interesting person for you to talk to. The company is still very young. Have you met her?
No, I haven't. But microgrids, at least in Canada anyway, like the federal government here have recognized that microgrids in the Arctic are not only in the Arctic, in northern Canada, and even some of the northern provinces are a big issue that need to be resolved. So yeah, there's a lot of talk right now of what the best solution is and trying to develop the right solution for each individual community. And that's where we really hope the toolkit can come into play and help guide the community to getting the right solution for the community and putting them into the driver's seat as opposed to being pitched a project. We really want to focus on the community having the opportunity to kind of develop and see what the right project for them is, and then getting the technical response behind it.
Wonderful. I know the time is basically up, but we have one question coming in from Diane. And Diane, if you want to ask your question yourself, I unmuted you.
Oh, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, Grant. But I'm wondering what your chances are for stopping drilling in ANWR when some of the Alaska Native corporations support it, like the Arctic Slope Corporation and the Yukon Corporation.
For sure. That's the reality. I can't speak for those corporations. Those are Inuit corporations, I understand. But the Gwich'in organizations as the nation have all denounced the ANWR. There is constant missions down, and I mean, Canadian and U.S. Gwich'in are flying down to Washington to advocate for that. What the likelihood? I don't know. Are we fighting it? Yes, we are. And that's the best we can actually do. Like, what will be the result? I don't know. But we are taking as much action as we possibly can.
Yes, Brendan.
Yeah, Max, if I can jump in, I have one additional question if we have a moment for that. I'm always interested in the narrative structure or how people tell these stories, especially to communicate to very diverse communities. And then one of the things you mentioned, Grant, in your presentation was if you've been to one of these communities, you've been to one of these communities, which I really like. And I also appreciate the fact that you referenced this YouTube video that was put out to discuss the solar panel project in Old Crow. But then at the beginning, the very beginning of your presentation, you talked about how using cost, if you could really develop sort of the story around cost, that would be you'd be able to make a strong case for renewables in the area. I was wondering what have you found in telling this story? Is cost a really strong narrative structure to use? Have you found success in that, or do you find other means of communication just as important, or perhaps at times even more beneficial?
For sure. Like I said before, like my background, I'm an accountant. So I went to what I understand, which was the cost. It was actually surprising. Like when we did the technical report, like the technical report is 30 pages of technical information of what comprises the cost. And that's why we really wanted to make sure that we had the infographic in there. That's the outward facing document. The technical report was more for us to have the discussion with the utility and the government. Like that, I can't, it was such an important discussion for us to have a discussion with the utility as the First Nation. It was, we now are having a conversation about the electrical energy costs at Inuvik. That is such a huge step for us, where we're not just saying we want to put solar in the community. No, we understand what your costs are, and we still want to do this because this is where it's going to land in the overall cost structure. And getting the community around the general concepts of the cost and the structure, how it is, because people in the north have a really good understanding what it costs to live there, because we are that close to the line of making it or not making it. So they have, like, the homeowners in the north have a good understanding of what the energy is. Did they have the full detail of what comprised that? No. And truthfully, the utility liked the fact that we brought that forward to them, saying, this is what actually comprised the cost of why you're paying your 68 cents a kilowatt. This is what it looks like and why you're paying this much. And so that it was, we're not trying to pitch the community against the utility. We want the utility and the community to work together to solve a better problem, to solve the bigger problem. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but.
No, but it really explains, the importance of communication and in having a kind of a goal, to open up a broader conversation and to get that conversation going. So not necessarily controlling the dialogue, but instigating one, which I think is very valuable, especially when you start talking about community participation in making these decisions for themselves. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, if I may jump in, Grant, if you want to say a last comment or anything to the group, you can do this now. I certainly will also invite you, if you have time and if you want to stay on, you can stay with us for the second hour. You can also ask very difficult questions to our other presenters. I always invite people to do that, but if you're busy and if you need to go to a different meeting or something else, I totally understand that. So feel free to either say something, say goodbye, or stay with us. And either way, I want to thank you already now. It was really phenomenal, very interesting, and I hope it was also interesting for you.
Well, it was. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this. I rarely turn down the opportunity to talk about renewable energy in the Arctic because there's not a lot of us doing it. So it's nice to chat with other folks about it. I will have to sign off. I've actually guiltily plugged in my children to the television for the last hour, and they've maintained quiet. So I don't know if I can push it another hour. But thanks so much, and I look forward to watching the recording after.
Right.
Well, thank you so much. We'll be in touch and hope to see you soon again. Thank you and bye-bye. And Dario, really sorry. I think I overlooked your question. And I will now also formally hand over to Brendan to moderate the second panel.
Well, while you're handing over, do you want to go ahead and make Dario the presenter, Max? I'd appreciate that. So now, of course, we're going to work our way into our second session, or our second half of this session. And since it's the second week of the energy and resources theme, of course, we have participant presentations. I'm sorry, my computer still shows. There we go. Much better. Yeah, so we have the participant presentations this week, and we have two members of the group. And a little bit like the first group presentations, we'll have two separate presentations. Each member of this group will present independently. We'll go first Dario, and then Ashley will be presenting. It's of course, they're both on the topic of energy resources, but what I'm kind of fascinated by is finding a way to connect the two. And I think when you watch the presentations, when we see the presentations, it'll become clear. We're going to start with Dario, who is looking at the legal implications of drilling, especially with I guess we see it all now, with Norway. And then we'll move into Ashley, who's going to talk about China's efforts to, I would almost say, expand the map of the Arctic by getting involved, especially in Alaska, with drilling, dreams of drilling. So I think, and this also is a very nice segue in a sense to next week's new theme, which will be governance structures. So Dario, if you want to pop your face up on the screen, perhaps.
Okay, my face is not on the screen. Okay,
no, maybe I'll send you a.
I will try this maybe.
Now it'll come up. There you are. Perfect. And then I'm still seeing what I assume to be somebody else's screen with the Gwich'in Council. There it is. Okay, now I'm happy. And I will let you take over, Dario. If you just want to remind everybody where you are and what you're working on, and then go ahead and begin your presentation. I will hide myself, but if you need anything, just I'm not that far away. Okay?
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, so I'm calling in from Sweden, from Stockholm actually. Now I think yeah, I believe now it's working, I guess. Yeah, so I'm calling in from Sweden, and me and Ashley, as Brennan just introduced, we're gonna sort of decline into different aspects of the same issue, which is sort of resource discovering in the Arctic. And I believe a common thread here could be that Ashley will be looking mostly at the explorative way of the issue. What can happen if, for example, China will be involving itself in Alaska. Well, I'm looking at what can happen afterwards. So the legal implication is something that already is ongoing, which is exploring or extracting in the Norwegian Arctic. And yes, so I found this topic extremely interesting for me. Not only I lived in Norway for many years, but also now we can see more often sort of international NGOs, environmental NGOs that are trying to challenge a certain state or group of states on the basis of international law, such as the Paris Agreement. So I think this is really this particular case of Greenpeace, Norway Greenpeace litigation in 2016 and 18 is a pretty timely and interesting issue. And I will just start off by providing a small introduction. And we went into this already, I believe, last week. So I will not, I will gloss over here quicker. But sort of, this is a picture with that sort of presents the status of the current status of the Norwegian continental shelf as of May 2018. And so, of course, oil and gas, the drilling industry constitutes a huge part of the Norwegian welfare, and it's been like this for the last 50 years. And I believe as of last year, since the drilling started in 1971, so as of last year there were 107 active sort of fields in the in Norway. So I think the estimates for this year predict that the net cash that will flow from drilling will amount to more than 220 billion. So this is it's a huge part of the Norwegian economy. And so here we see the areas that are marked in green on the screen. We see the North Sea, the Norwegian Sea, and in the upper part, the Barents Sea. And so the area that is the areas that are marked in green are the areas that are open for petroleum activity, and the area that is marked in yellow is subject to a sort of special regulation. It's I believe it's called let's see, I written down the name. Well, there's a policy paper from the starting that sort of regulates the areas marked in yellow, whereas the areas that are sort of confined in the red, in the red lines, they are subject to the awards system. So as I will go into that a little bit later, but the government sort of issues licensing rounds and sort of opens up. It's sort of a competition for which firms can step into the business. And so so if we look a little bit more about the specific of this field, so we see this chart, this picture provides sort of an estimate of the resources that are believed to be sort of laying oil and gas that are believed to be laying down the continental shelf. And so the slanted lines here sort of provide an estimate basically. But if you look down at at this chart, we see that the Barents Sea is definitely the most appealing when it comes to sort of exploring the area. 63% of undiscovered resources are believed to be laying in the Barents Sea, and the Barents Sea has not been touched in 20 years. And this is especially relevant for what I will be saying right now. And and the rest is sort of fairly divided by the Norwegian Sea and the North Sea. And here, so now I can basically start with the sort of the juicy part of the story. So in January 2015, as the Norwegian government does kind of regularly, they open up this sort of competition. They issue this this licensing round, which is basically called for applications from firms that are interested in engaging in extractive activities in the areas that the Norwegian government allows them to sort of allows to be explored. And the vast majority, I think it was around 60 fields was sort of offered on the market, and of these 57 were in the Barents Sea. So this was the first time in 20 years that that the Barents Sea was opened up again for exploration. And then later on, the round was closed, and 13 firms were allocated 10 exploring sites in the area, and we can see them here. And so basically, yeah. So I should also say that this happened, in 2016, and now it's been almost 2 years later, and these fields are not proven to be really sort of rich as they were dreamed to be. And I think Shell, Statoil, now Statoil as the new name, which is Equinor. But anyway, so Statoil now has pulled back on drilling in the area. But also this area is particularly interesting because not only has now been open to exploration for 20 years, but also has been up to the when the round was open, had been a sort of disputed area with Russia. So it was a pretty hot topic. And so and here this is sort of the backdrop of this introduction of the case. So in November 2016, 3 main Norwegian actors, like international non-governmental organizations by the name of Greenpeace Norway, and then Youth and Nature, Unge Natur, and then the grandparents organization, which is called. They sort of feel the cause to bring the Norwegian state to court. And basically, the main sort of complaint was that the grounds were that the Norwegian state will be violating the section 112 of the Constitution, which I will be reading now in its full extent. And then also they were claiming that the Norwegian government, by opening up a new area for exploration, which is namely the northernmost part of the the Barents, the northernmost part of the areas that are open for drilling, which is the Barents Sea, would sort of put Norway against the objective of the Paris Agreement 2015, which is, as you know, to keep the temperature rising below 1.5 degrees. And so these were the sort of the grounding, and they use these sort of arguments, and the state, the Norwegian state, is replying by saying that Norway they believe Norway had fulfilled the obligation, and they had sort of conducted a thorough and exhaustive and complying not only exploration but also a procedure to allocate the different sites to the firms. And before going into the specifics of these first 2 points, I should also say, for me, it was really interesting to learn that when in the immediate aftermath of this, when this case became public in the Norwegian sort of media and in the Norwegian environment, there was a lot of talks about in the academia about what is happening now, what will happen if the Norwegian court will stop the sort of issuing of drilling permits in the Arctic. And I read at the time also, I read some pretty strong opinions by some lawyers and also some sort of really well-known figures in the Norwegian academia. They said that basically now it's a little bit sort of, they spoke about a revolution in the traditional separation of powers, and especially with regards to the judiciary and the executive powers. I remember reading this, one of these figures sort of said this could be, if the Norwegian Supreme Court, if the Norwegian court would stop the drilling, this would be the biggest interference, so the biggest stepping in of a court since 1940, when the monarchy, the Norwegian common monarchy, had fled the country, and then the Norwegian Supreme Court established a sort of temporary government. And at the same time, though, while there is the risk of sort of interference of the judiciary into a politically elected government, there are voices that said that sometimes maybe now it's the time for the judiciary power to step in when the executive power is vacant. So I don't know. This was really, you know, it was a huge, a pretty big deal when that happened. And so by going, I want to now dwell into a little bit about in the section 112 of the Constitution that I want to read in its all entirety. It's not that long. So it says, every person has the right to an environment that is conducive to health and to a natural environment whose productivity and diversity are maintained. Natural resources shall be managed on the basis of comprehensive long-term considerations, which will safeguard this right for future generations as well. In order to safeguard the right in accordance with the foregoing paragraph, citizens are entitled to information on the state of the natural environment and on the effects of any encroachment on nature that is planned or carried out. The authorities of the state shall take measures for the implementation of these principles. So this is what the section 112 of the Constitution, the Norwegian Constitution says, and this section basically contains sort of transfers to the Norwegian Constitution the principle of sort of respecting the environment and even the rights to a safe and a healthy nature and environment. And this article, this section of the Constitution is pretty interesting in itself. So the Norwegian Constitution was the second oldest sort of working constitution that we have as of today. So it's a pretty old document. In 2014, it was celebrated its 200th birthday. But in 2014, there was a sort of a major, pretty big reform of the Constitution. And among others, the article that was touched was also the article that at the time was the 110B, which then became the 112. And the reason why I mentioned this is because Greenpeace and the other two organizations that were sort of suing the state were, of course, claiming that the states allowing drilling in the Arctic was breaching this article. So the reason why this is relevant is because so first of all, the article the article that at the time was 110B was born was born as I said, as a sort of to give universality and constitutional weight to the protection of nature and environment. But at the same time, its content is very vague, and it doesn't really or many believe it didn't really put any sort of any strong agency or any duty on the state. And I'm not gonna read the Norwegian part here, but it says basically, I translated it, and as it sounded back then, it basically said that the government gives further provisions to implement, and then it said, and to implement environmental measures. But then after the reform of 2014, the Human Rights Committee that was sort of working on the reform, they sort of also introduced the verb skal, which is shall, and sort of this was interpreted as a way to sort of to enforce and to make it even stronger and compelling the duty of the state to actually act so that the nature and environment could be protected accordingly. And also, it's also interesting for me to mention that when the reform happened, this section 110B was actually moved under the cluster E of the Constitution, which is the one that is devoted to human rights. So so yes, so basically, this article that Greenpeace and Youth and Nature and the grandparents organizations are using to sue the state is pretty strong. It does pose a pretty strong agency responsibility on the state. And so I want to go then quickly to what happened when the lawsuit started in 2016, but it wasn't really, the actual court sort of proceedings did not start until late 2017, and then it was concluded in 2018. And the lawsuit was actually dismissed by the Oslo court that was taken into consideration. And the reason why they dismissed that was, first of all, they did not find any breach of the constitution or any administrative sort of failure in the Norwegian government to allocate or to explore the possibilities for drilling in the Barents Sea. And also, I think something really interesting that I read in the proceedings when the Oslo court ruled in favor of the Norwegian state was that they actually said that these kind of issues, this kind of sort of discussion on environments issues, they should be the domain of politics, not the domain of courts and of proceedings into courts or tribunals. So they sort of remitted this issue to the politicians and not to the judiciary. And I feel this is really interesting. But at the same time, in the wake of this sentence, the Greenpeace announced kind of early that they actually were willing to sort of get back and sort of try again to go again this way of suing the state. And actually they claim that they should be pretty proud of the outcome nonetheless, because it's true, many agree that this article 112 it's a pretty huge article, and it's been sort of sleeping. It's a dormant principle. It's really general, and they claim it's a little bit hard to put into practice. So maybe Greenpeace and those that actually campaign for them, as well as for those that sue the state, they actually claim that maybe this sentence will help sort of shake up sort of wake up this principle that is being dormant so far. And yes, I think as I said, this is it's a sort of confused, it's a muddy issue, it raises a lot of complicated questions. Where is the responsibility of the state? Can the judiciary intervene when the state is not intervening? And also, what is really interesting here is that one of the reasonings that were given by the Oslo court was that Norway as a country cannot be held responsible for sort of the burning of oil that happens somewhere else than Norway. So I think this is also really interesting. So and I myself, when I started to delve into this topic, I realized that it was not as straightforward as I was hoping it to be. So I also apologize here, because a lot of documents that I found were in Norwegian, so it was pretty hard to sort of make the sense out of it and then translate it into English and present it to you. But yeah, this is what I did prepare for this presentation, and so I sure forgot something. So let me feel free to ask me questions if you have any at the end. Yes, thank you.
Very good. All right, thank you, Dario. No, I think this is really interesting, especially looking around at other countries as well. I know in the United States, for example, there has been a lot of movement. There's a group of young children who are suing the federal government for violating their right to life, liberty, and property because of their failure to act on climate change. And of course, it becomes very difficult, because where do you find that protection in the governing documents? And this change that was made in 2014 that sort of implies that the government does have, is required to do some work, would seem to be a good argument, legal argument, that their failure to do work is a violation of that constitution. So it is interesting, and I'm really happy you brought up that point about the about how some of the public discourse arguments about it at the time were almost threatening toward the court, you know, saying that if they were to decide against the state, then they would be, you know, destroying democracy of some kind, and that can also kind of play into the matter as well. So I really appreciate it. It's a really fascinating topic, and it's something that I think we'll see more and more of. I have a feeling there will be opportunity for questions and discussion at the after Ashley's presentation. So I think the best thing to do now is to move on. So thank you very much, Dario. We'll call you back when we open up the question and answer portion. But now I want to invite Ashley to come back, and somehow I'm going to Max, are you there? Perhaps.
Yes, I will do this. Just a second.
I'm really bad at button pushing. I've never mastered the art. So
Ashley is the presenter now.
Okay, thank you. So Ashley, you should be able to share your screen, whether you like it or not. Perfect. And I will step away if you want to give a short introduction, remind everybody where you are, and go ahead. We are just about on time, so it would be great to have a few minutes for conversation at the end of your presentation. And to facilitate that, I will go away now. But if anything comes up, just let me know. Okay? Oh.
So Ashley, we couldn't hear you. Now I think your microphone should be open.
Yes, I think my microphone is working, but for some reason my presentation, I don't know if you can see it right now, can you?
No, and so if you speak up a little bit, I think maybe that's just my audio, but it seemed a little bit low volume. But anyway, I can see your full screen presentation now. This seems to be working.
Okay, great. Can you hear me any better now?
I can. It was louder with the other presenters, but maybe that's just my ears that are fading after 1.5 hours. Anybody else having issue hearing, or is that fine?
No, I see that Diane is mentioning that it's a little bit difficult to hear. I had to turn the volume up on my headset as well. So, but once I did, it was fine.
Okay. Yeah, I'm on headphones, so maybe that's the issue.
Okay.
Okay. All right, well, first off, hello everyone. Greetings from Washington, D.C. My name is Ashley Postler. I'm a master's candidate at Georgetown University here in D.C., studying security studies. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about China's investments in the Arctic, particularly its energy investments, which have taken off in recent years. Within this topic, I will focus on the role that Alaska plays in China's overall vision for the Arctic. So this presentation will proceed in two parts. First, I will outline China's Arctic strategy in the context of its Belt and Road Initiative. I'll then proceed with a discussion of Alaska's energy potential and China's recent investments in Alaska's energy infrastructure and development, notably the $43 billion Alaska LNG project. So to understand China's strategy for the Arctic, it's best to start with the Belt and Road Initiative, formerly the One Belt, One Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative was announced in 2013 and can be loosely described as encompassing a broad Chinese effort to lead the development of cooperation and connectivity between Eurasia and Europe and even South America. Its original conception entailed building infrastructure to more easily facilitate China's trading objectives. So this encompasses land and maritime-based routes for example, the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road, respectively. The emphasis is on, as I mentioned, building up economic corridors. As you can see on the map, there's railroad construction, the building of ports, airports, that sort of thing to facilitate trade. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. China's Arctic strategy, or the Polar Silk Road, is a new addition to the Belt and Road Initiative. This white paper was announced half a decade later after the Belt and Road Initiative was announced, at the beginning of this year, in fact. It outlines China's ambitious objectives for the Arctic and notably introduces itself as a, quote, near Arctic state, a term China itself devised to better integrate into the broader Arctic community and conversation. The white paper focuses on living and non-living resource development and tourism. And to access that vast resource wealth in the nation, China will be investing in shipping infrastructure. China, of course, stresses that the concerns and rights of all Arctic states will be respected, along with its responsibilities under international law, such as the Law of the Sea and the Spitsbergen Treaty. So what drives China's interest in the Arctic and later, as we'll discuss, Alaska? China sees a tremendous opportunity in the warming Arctic region. In 2013, China successfully lobbied for a seat at the Arctic Council as an observer state. This essentially afforded China a very back seat at the table. Observers don't have the right to introduce new projects or raise issues with the Council, but observer status does, however, acknowledge that a state has significant enough interests and assets in the region, so they can essentially sit in on meetings. Specifically, China views opening Arctic shipping routes as a faster and cheaper way to not only export its goods, but also import some of the critical resources that are quickly becoming more accessible in the Arctic. Given that so much of the Arctic is currently underdeveloped, which inhibits such trade goals, China is stepping up to work with Arctic countries to develop infrastructure to allow that. So this slide just illustrates the major shipping routes emerging in the Arctic, and I apologize if some of this is repetitive for you listening. So here we see the Northern Sea Route, which runs across the north coast of Russia, and the Northwest Passage, which cuts through the Canadian archipelago. Also, we see here the Transpolar Route, which isn't really viable yet, but as the map shows, will traverse the region over the Arctic Ocean, maybe in a few decades. Right now, China conducts most of its Arctic shipping along the Northern Sea Route, which I like to think of as a Russian toll road of sorts. Russia's Northern Sea Route Authority oversees the route, and given that it runs through Russian waters, ships transiting along this route are subject to all the associated costs. The Transpolar Route, on the other hand, if, but more likely when, it becomes regularly accessible, will traverse international waters and thus represents a potentially less costly alternative to the Northern Sea Route and also the Northwest Passage. China's sole icebreaker, the Snow Dragon, services the Antarctic, but also has enabled the state's Arctic commercial shipping presence. The Snow Dragon is China's first Arctic icebreaker. It was built in 1993 in Ukraine and has been upgraded several times since. It's had a lot of firsts for China. In the summer of 2012, it was the first Chinese vessel to cross the Arctic Ocean, and in August of last year, it actually managed to circumnavigate the Arctic by transiting both the Northern Sea Route and Northwest Passage. Construction of a second icebreaker, the Snow Dragon 2, is underway, and I believe that'll be done sometime next year. So moving on to what all this means for Alaska. Here in the US, Alaska's needs and interests tend to get a little swept under the rug compared to those of the continental states. Unfortunately, this translates into widespread underdevelopment of its quite vast energy resources. China, however, sees in Alaska what has largely been overlooked. Alaska has vast energy resources. It is one of the largest crude oil producers in the US. Oil in Alaska is located along its north coast, in the North Slope, and offshore in the Beaufort Sea. Alaska also ranks third in the United States for natural gas, which is also located in Prudhoe Bay in the North Slope and south in the Kenai Peninsula. Despite these vast resources, there's an increasing development of renewable energy, particularly wind, hydro, and geothermal electricity. Oil is one of Alaska's most prominent resources. North America's largest oil field is found in the North Slope of Alaska, along its northern coast and offshore in the Beaufort Sea, as previously mentioned. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline system runs 800 miles south from Prudhoe Bay in the North Slope to the warm water port at Valdez in southern Alaska. Construction of the pipeline was actually complete over 40 years ago in 1977, but the past 10 years have actually seen a significant decline in its use, about 39% actually, in terms of its operating capacity. So right now, the pipeline is only operating at a third of its operating capacity, which has sort of brought its future into question. There are new opportunities arising for oil drilling in Alaska, and as we're about to see, this could help offset that problem and extend the life of the pipeline. So this is just a map of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. As you can see, it runs north to south, cutting through central Alaska, where it provides some much needed energy to the state's most underdeveloped and remote areas. So one of the new oil drilling opportunities in Alaska that would help to revitalize the pipeline is located in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, or as we call it, the ANWR. For decades, oil drilling was prohibited in ANWR, which is located along the northern coast of Alaska as well, sandwiched between Prudhoe Bay and the Canadian border. Just last year, however, the Trump administration passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which will free up a section of ANWR for studies to explore its oil drilling potential. The section in question is referred to as the 1002 area or 1002 area. It comprises a 1.5 million acre section of ANWR's total 19 million acres. This area is estimated to contain 5 to 16 billion barrels of oil and has gained significant industry interest. But right now, oil drilling in ANWR is still in the beginning stages. Companies, however, are looking ahead to developing these resources over the next 10 to 20 years. So again, here's just another map for everyone. As you can see, the ANWR is located next to Canada, and the little orange section is where drilling will probably be taking place over the next couple of decades. Actually, just going back, I wanted to mention that one of the biggest concerns, among myriad environmental concerns regarding drilling in ANWR, Canada has raised the issue of the potential for oil drilling to negatively impact the migratory patterns of caribou in the region. So as we move forward, or as the US and companies move forward with drilling in this area, this is just one of the many environmental concerns that we'll have to take into consideration in order for this oil to be viable. In addition to oil, Alaska is also quite rich in liquid natural gas. Liquid natural gas in Alaska is located in the North Slope and in the southern Kenai Peninsula. The gas fields in Kenai, however, have been closed since 2015. The US refiner company Endeavor has actually recently purchased the site from ConocoPhillips, so we'll see what happens there in the coming years. The North Slope liquid natural gas resources actually are what has grabbed China's interest in Alaska. As it stands, there is no pipeline currently to transport LNG south from the North Slope. So what happens is that the gas is separated from the oil at Prudhoe Bay and placed back into the ground. It is estimated that the North Slope actually contains 35 trillion cubic feet of proven natural gas reserves, and it's estimated that there are 200 trillion more cubic feet of natural gas down below. So enter China. The Alaska LNG project was actually conceived in 2014, though at that point it was considered the least economically competitive LNG project in the world. It has since hit a lot of bumps along the way in terms of its development, but in China's search for LNG imports, it has received renewed attention as of late. China is a serious exporter of liquid natural gas. In fact, it's the world's second largest LNG exporter. China predicts that it will need 60 million tons per year through 2030, and the deals that it currently has with Australia, Qatar, and others will only fulfill 2/3 of that annual need. So in order to make up for the extra 20 million, they've had to search elsewhere, and they've stumbled across Alaska. The LNG project deal as it currently stands is signed between China and the Alaska Gasline Development Corporation, and the Chinese companies that are involved are Sinopec, which is China's largest state-owned oil company, China Investment Corporation, and the Bank of China. What happens with this project, according to the deal, is that the Bank of China will loan AGDC 75% of the estimated $43 billion for the pipeline and liquefaction plant construction. AGDC will then reserve 70% of all its pipeline, liquefaction, and terminal capacity for Sinopec, which in turn will pay back Bank of China. This project is expected to generate $8 to $10 billion per year, and the Bank of China is expected to receive about $3.5 billion of that annually. The construction projects for this will include, of course, a gas treatment plant along the North Slope so that the oil, when the gas is separated from the oil, it doesn't have to go back into the ground. It can then be placed into a pipeline, which will also be constructed, which will connect the North Slope to South Central Alaska and a newly built liquefaction plant in Nikiski. So as you are probably all aware, the US is in the middle of a trade war with China. However, that has not stopped China from investing in Alaska at the subnational level. And that is what happened with the Alaska LNG project. For a long time, US federal investment in the state has remained quite low. As a result, infrastructure across Alaska has remained underdeveloped and energy costs for Alaskans are sky high. Alaskan residents largely welcome development of its LNG resources as a way to ameliorate these issues. While the LNG deal with Alaska is not yet binding, the agreement, which was signed in Beijing last year, should not only revitalize Alaska's infrastructure, but also provide about 12,000 jobs to Alaskans, which is one of the main priorities of this current administration. China could, at this point, still abandon the project in favor of another project elsewhere, perhaps at a lower cost or ease of access. But the fact remains that China remains very close to Alaska geographically, and thus there's a little bit of an incentive to continue for China to continue moving forward with the LNG project in Alaska. And that is all I have for today. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Well, that was really interesting, Ashley. I really appreciate that. It's you went very deep into the relationship between Alaska and China, and I think that that is something not a lot of us have thought about. It's also very fascinating to see the very basic needs. China has a demand, and Alaska has a supply, And so the relationship seems very basic. Yeah, the most, it's an ideal situation for both parties. It then becomes interesting when we think of Alaska not as, a state within the United States, but as a member of the Arctic region and with the Arctic community. And so what will, how will that then affect both their decision making, and also how will it impact other members of the Arctic community? I think that could be interesting. I want to invite Dario to come back so that he can join us for the full conversation, and so we can start taking some questions from the other participants, and also for Max to join us as well. But I wanted to start with that question. What do you think, or what has your research or your interest shown about that? What would or could or has the Arctic Council said about Alaska in this instance, but individual states kind of making these deals with countries or entities outside of the traditional circle?
Well, I've noticed that China has been making a lot of connections with other countries in the Arctic. One of the things I didn't get a chance to go into today was China's investments in Greenland, such as mining and tourism, and also across Russia, there's the Yamal LNG plant, which not only ships LNG to Europe, or I'm sorry, transports LNG to Europe by a pipeline, but then, of course, along the Northern Sea route to China. And then there's also some things China has going on in Norway, lot to do with research. But so it'll be really interesting to see what else China gets up to in the region. And then I know I in particular will be really paying attention to what else happens in Alaska.
I guess just to follow up, so do you see China's intentions here? We talk a lot about, especially in international relations right now, this multilateralism versus bilateralism, and it seems that China is really working to build individual relationships with each of these potential partners in that. Do you see that as a trend of theirs rather than working within the collective?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of that has to do maybe with the fact that China is just an observer on the Arctic Council, and thus by forming these bilateral relationships, it'll be better suited to leveraging its own interest in that forum as the region develops. Does that make sense?
No, I think that's perfect. I mean, I would agree with you on that. Max, did you have any questions, or did you want to bring up anything? Otherwise, I have some questions that we can talk to Dario about.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I mean, we only have a few minutes left. I definitely have a lot of questions on my mind, but I think it's good if you want to ask Dario something, and maybe we can even get one or two more questions from participants. Otherwise, I'll use the time that's left definitely for my questions.
There we go.
Otherwise, I can. Oh, you have your question. Great.
Go ahead, Max. I have to understand.
Okay. Well, then I will bring back this question, because Ashley, just coming back to maybe like a more long-term perspective, because a lot of these investments, they're of course meant for not 5 years, not 10 years, and you talk about basically extending the lifetime of a pipeline, so basically so that it pays back the investment. And of course, if we look at all this in the context of where we are going or where we're not going, right? Nobody knows the future, and we've seen a future laid out with more renewables or switching into renewables from the previous speaker. And of course, I know that traditional energy forecasts foresee oil to be important until basically the last part of this century. But we also know that change happens, sometimes happens very quickly, and is not always linear in its form. So what's your view on what if all these investments are basically going to be lost and failed? Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I don't really, I guess, know what companies will do should things in the Arctic not pan out. But we have seen companies withdrawing from, off the top of my head, I can think of in Alaska, how companies stopped exploring for oil in the recent years because the harsh conditions make drilling really difficult, and sometimes it's not worth the cost. And we see that as well with shipping. So I think it was like in 2013 or maybe 2012, cargo transit along the Northern Sea Route hit like an all-time high with, I think, like 71 ships transiting that year. And then after a couple of years, it really died down. And I think a lot of that had to do with shipping companies just starting to believe that it wasn't as profitable yet, given that the Arctic has not yet suitably thawed enough and dangers and difficulties still remain. That being said, for the Northern Sea Route, Russia actually does a lot to keep it open. I think they've like sectioned off the route into about 7 sections, and they have dedicated icebreakers for each route, keeping it open. So they've tried to keep that sort of industry very viable in the wake of all this uncertainty about what actually is going to happen over the next coming decades.
Yeah, and actually that's a perfect segue into something I wanted to talk with Dario about. We don't know what's going to happen in the Arctic, or we don't actually know. And that was one of the problems that they had in the Barents Sea, right, Dario? That they expected there to be the drilling or the opportunities there to be much more fruitful than they actually ended up being. And so that becomes also kind of a comical turn, right? So it's kind of a wasted approach. What do you see? And I know Statoil is like attempting to redefine their image a little bit, but I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Is that just me?
They also have a new name now. They're no longer Statoil.
Okay, no, I had to. I think it's all good. Yeah, Statoil. I don't know what they call themselves now. You said the name before, but it was. Yeah, and I don't know if you're still muted, but it would be great to get your input on this about the idea of, yeah, what was Norway's experience? What did they do? How did they respond when they realized that this area in the Barents Sea didn't have what they were expecting? And what was their answer?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yes.
perfect.
Okay, so the new name is Equinor. I said it like 4 times and no one could hear me. So now my roommate's Anyway, no, I think yeah, that's a good question. But I think what's interesting also choosing the name, the reason why Statoil changed the name to Equinor was to like signalize that they, Equinor equality. There's a sort of more sort of stepping in of focus on renewable resources or sort of more future thinking, And I think what's really interesting with Equinor is that they always, they never give up in a way. They always sort of they're always very positive about drilling and developing. And so I think, well, the reaction to not finding sort of anything in the Barents Sea was not a defeat, not at all. So I wouldn't say. I mean, was a defeat in a single case, but if you look at the broader picture, there's more than 100 active drilling spots in the area, and more to come. So I feel, yes.
No, and it's interesting because another similarity between what we learned about with Alaska, but also with Norway. I mean, I don't know everything about Norway, but they like to position themselves as having renewable energy, and
Mm-hmm.
they have these relatively ambitious goals when it comes to Paris and trying to transition. Yet they're not slowing down on pumping oil, so they're looking at this more as an export situation, right?
Yeah, and also there's always that's a sort of, I think this binary position is also what is maybe because I've also looked at other international sources of law. If we look at the European Union, can this be enough for for stopping the drilling in the Arctic. If we look at the international law, can it be enough to stop the drilling in the Arctic? And the problem is that there's always this sort of really strong dichotomy between safeguarding the environment, but also developing in the area, you know. And this is what Norway, the Prime Minister Erna Solberg is always saying. She said that she's aware of the environmental concerns, but also she has to embrace the economic opportunities that come with it, you know. Yeah. So I think, yeah, and the government, the Norwegian government, has been right-oriented now for more than 4 years, and they have a really strong majority. So I think there's no risk of them being overthrown anytime soon on this point.
Max, did you have anything? Or you're muted again. Okay, so
sorry. I didn't notice this. Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting, this dichotomy, and also if you look at the sovereign wealth fund of Norway, which is divesting from fossil investments, but of course the source for the income is from fossil sales, and it's a very interesting strategy in many ways. And of course, we know, especially with countries that rely on the fossil revenue for daily survival, that's very risky. And Norway is probably very different, that they actually save this money for the future. So it's not all gone by tomorrow. And very different approaches in different countries. We talked about Alaska. I just remember, Brendan, last year we had a presentation at the Arctic Circle Assembly about the idea of an Arctic supranational wealth fund, where all the Arctic neighbors would pool to actually benefit the residents of the Arctic. Of course, this was a very far-flung idea, but this is all very interesting. Like, how do you keep opportunities for the future generations, right? That's the important thing, to use what you have, but also enable the future generations to benefit.
I find actually this split with Alaska, China, and Norway, and seeing how all three kind of fit into the story of drilling in the Arctic. It's something that's a little bit strange, especially when we heard our first. Well, actually, last week was very heavily into fossil fuels, and this week we understand even more the importance of fossil fuels, not only in the small communities, but even for the major economies of the world. So when people talk about post-carbon society or transitioning, you know, the energy systems to 100% renewable, it's kind of a reminder of how steep a climb that would be, and that it's whether we can do that from one day to the next, I think we've already found out isn't going to happen. But and it's also interesting to see the different procedures, you know, with our first presentation today, talking about going community to community and building up this demand. But then also in Norway, I kind of like these different groups, you know, Greenpeace coming in to work on this. But then also in Alaska, you know, looking at these smaller areas, not just opening up everything and saying, let's go in and take everything we can, but actually going through a process that incorporates attention, we'll say at least, to environmental issues in their planning. It's very, very complicated. It's a very large chessboard. And so it's interesting to see where some of the pieces are sitting at the moment. Actually, I want to give you a chance to final comment, or if you don't want to have a comment, it would be great to know, what are you planning to do with this? I mean, this research is quite interesting. You said you're interested in China. Are you thinking of going into international energy trade relations, or?
Well, I'd like to work in the security field. My interest area is specifically the Arctic, but I focus a lot on Russia. That's where my background was in undergrad. So I'm very familiar with Russia, and I kind of saw this as an opportunity to learn more about what China is getting involved in here. So, I mean, that being said, moving forward, I definitely, you know, look into exploring options with like what China is doing, but also in Russia. And after I graduate, I hope to do a Fulbright in the Arctic somewhere.
Very nice. And Dario, you're in Stockholm right now. Do you live there? Is that where you're doing research, or what are you doing?
I live here. I completed all my higher education in Norway, but then I moved to Sweden to work at the embassy of Italy here. And then now, yeah, but now I should be starting in a new embassy, so that will be exciting.
Oh, very good. So maybe somewhere a little cooler than where it is now.
Oh yeah, it's really warm here.
Well, very good. I really appreciate the work. Next week we switch over to the governance theme. We'll have a couple of speakers. Max is well aware of who they are. Unfortunately, I'm not at this moment, but I will become so. Thank you very much, both Ashley and Dario. It was really fascinating. I really appreciate the diversity of topics that still, and this is what we always find with the Arctic, have that thread that go through them, that really connects this area with the rest of the world. So thank you for your hard work and for your communication and efforts over the course of the last couple of weeks. We will see everybody next week at the same time, same place, I assume. And until then, if you have any questions, any concerns, if the governance group wants to start talking a little more about what their plans are, please go ahead and send us an email. Until then, have a wonderful evening, have a good week, and we will see you all next week. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.